वेलकम टू माय यूट्यूब चैनल द सोलफुल डायरी। आज के वीडियो में हम डिस्कस करेंगे लिटरेरी थ्योरी को। तो आज के वीडियो का टॉपिक है थ्योरी बिफोर थ्योरी। चलिए स्टार्ट करते हैं आज के वीडियो को शुरू करने से पहले कुछ क्वेश्चंस पूछते हैं आपसे। व्हेन डू यू थिंक इंग्लिश वाज फर्स्ट टॉट एज अ डिग्री सब्जेक्ट इन इंग्लैंड? वाज इट 1428, 1528, 1628, 1728, 1828, or 1928? At which institution was English first taught as a degree subject in England? Was it Oxford University, Cambridge University, London, Southampton University, or none of these? Until the 19th century, you had to be a member of the English Episcopalian College and male to take a degree in England. True or false? Until the 19th century, lectures on degree courses in England had to be unmarried Church of England clergy. True or false? Until the 19th century, women were not allowed to take degrees in England. True or false? In the early 20th century, women could take degrees courses in England but were not allowed to receive degrees. True or false? चलिए अब आंसर्स चेक करते हैं. The answer is 1828. The second is King's College. The third is true. The fourth is true. The fifth is true. The sixth is true. So how many of you got all the answers correct? चलिए डिस्कस करते हैं आज की थ्योरी. Anyone who was Catholic, Jewish, Methodist or atheist was barred from entry and hence in effect barred from the profession and civil service. The breakthrough came in 1826 when a university college was founded in London with a charter to award degrees to men of all religion or none. Girton College, Cambridge opened in 1869 and Newham Hall, later Newham College, at the same university in 1875, both for women, but women, as at Oxford from the late 1870s, though could attend lectures and take exams, could not receive actual degrees until 1920 at Oxford, and credible though it now seems 1948 at Cambridge, so women at Oxbridge only became full members of their universities in the 20th century. Edith Morley, 1875 to 1964, was the first female professor in England. She was appointed to a chair in English language at Reading University in 1928. Do you know when was first professor of English appointed? He was appointed in 1829. Murris regarded literature as the particular property of the middle class and expression of their values. For him, the middle class represents the essence of Englishness. The aristocracy are part of an intellectual elite, and the poor need to give all their attention to ensuring more survival. The Chartist agitation of the 1830s for the extension of voting rights to all adult male was thought to be the start of this, and the first course of English were put in place at exactly the same time. Matthew Arnold in the 1850s re- and reaches its height with the publication of the Newbold Report on the teaching of English in England in 1921. The London University degrees were taught by external license at university colleges in major industrial cities Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield, Leeds, and so on. All these places eventually becoming major universities in their own right. Hence, the spread of the subject at degree level throughout the country. However, Oxford and Cambridge were suspicion of the new subject of English and held against it. Oxford until 1894 and Cambridge until 1911. We are told the study of literature cultivates the taste, educates the sympathies, and enlarges the mind. These are all excellent things, only we cannot examine tastes and sympathies. Examiners must have technical and positive information to examine. There is problem with which has not never been entirely solved in English. What exactly is its knowledge component? As a way of attaching specific and technical information to the study of English, early supporters had advocated the systematic study of language, but early advocates of English wanted to separate literature and language study so that the one couldn't be done without other. Freeman's famous response was, "What is meant by distinguishes literature from language? If by literature is meant the study of great books and not mere chatter about Shelley." Freeman won the argument. Literature had to be studied along with language, otherwise, it would not be an academic subject at all. So, when the English course was finally set up at Oxford in 1894, it contained a strong element of historical language study, Anglo Saxon, Gothic, Later Slavonic, M- Middle English, etc., from which it has still not managed to free itself, or at least distinguish itself entirely. The rhetorical or non-philological mantle was inherited by the generalists, as Graff calls them, teachers like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Charles Eliot Norton, and James Russell Lowell at Harvard, who taught a much more generalized kind of literary appreciation. Generalists and philologists often coexisted uneasily in the same department, a familiar situation, but the drive towards the professionalization of the discipline was already well underway, and the generalists, in spite of their often charismatic and popular lecturing style, were seen as too unsystematic in their methods to prevail in the area of MLA. What is MLA? The Modern Language Association, founded in 1883, which became the discipline's main profession body in the USA. So the balance was finally tipped against philology only after the First World War, when an upsurge of patriotism inaugurated the formal study of American literature, and the emergent new critics of the 1920s established for the first time a coherent rationale for the study of literature as literature rather than as a language. Ira Richards was the founder of a method of studying English which is still the norm today. Firstly, it made a decisive break between language and literature. Richards pioneered the technique called practical criticism, the title of his 1929 book. Second Cambridge pioneer was the pupils of Richards William Empson, who presented his tutor with the manuscript of the book, which was published in 1930 with the title The Seven Types of Ambiguity. This book took Richard's methods of close verbal analysis, what many felt to be an extreme. Empson identified seven different types of verbal difficulty in poetry, which is what he meant by ambiguity, and gave examples of them with work analysis. T.S. Eliot called the lemon squeezer school of criticism, and his own critical writing is always on a much more generalized level. In 1929, he met and married Curie Roth, subsequently known as Curie Leibowitz. He had written his doctoral thesis on the relationship between journalism and literature. She had written hers on popular fiction. These were revolutionary topics, and a certain excitement and glamour attached to this couple in 1930s. In 1932, they founded an important journey called Scrutiny and produced it together for 21 years. He famously refused the invitation offered by the critic René Welleck in the 1930s that he should spell on the principles on which operated in a more explicit way than heretofore. Of liberal humanism, the first thing naturally is an attitude to literature itself. Good literature is of timeless significance, and it somehow transcends the limitation and peculiarities of the age it was written in, and thereby speaks to what is constant in human nature. Such writing is not for an age, but for all time, as Ben Jonson said of Shakespeare. It is the news which stays news, Esther Pound's definition of literature. The second point is the logical consequence of the first, that literary context contains its own meaning within itself. It doesn't require any elaborate process of placing it within a context, whether this be socio-political, the context of a particular social background or political situation, literary historical, whereby the work could be seen as the product of literary influences of other writers or as shaped by the conventions of particular genres, or autobiographical, that is as determined by the personal details of the author's life and thought. To understand the text well, it must be detached from these contexts and studied in isolation. What is needed is the close verbal analysis of the text without prior ideological assumptions or political preconditions, or indeed specific expectations of any kind, since all these are unlikely to interfere fatally with what the 19th century critic Matthew Arnold said was the true business of criticism: to see the object as in itself it really is. Human nature is essentially unchanging. The same passion, emotions, and even situation are seen again and again throughout human history. It follows the continuity in literature is more important and significant than innovation. Thus, a well-known 18th century definition of poetry maintains that it is what oft was thought but never so well expressed. Likewise, Samuel Johnson famously denigrated Sterne's novel Tristram Shandy on the ground of its novelty that it is its originality. Individuality is something securely persists within each one of us as a unique essence. The stressors our environmental influence and true individuality can change and develop. As to characters in novels, it can be transformed, hence our uneasiness with those scenes, quite common for instance in Dickens, which involve a change of heart in a character so that the whole personality is shifted into a new dimension by force of circle. The miser is transformed and changes his way, or the good man or woman become corrected by wealth. Such scenes imply a malleability in the essence of character which is at odds with this underlying assumption of English studies. The discipline as a whole believed in what is now called the transcendent subject, which is the belief that the individual, the subject, is antecedent to or transcends the forces of society, experience, and language. Literature is essentially the enhancement of life and the propagation of human values, but not in a programmatic way. If literature and criticism become overtly and directly political, they necessarily tend towards propaganda. And as Keats said, we distrust literature which has a palpable design upon us. That is literature which too obviously wants to convert us or influence our views. Form and content in literature must be fused in an organic way so that the one grows inevitably from the other. Literary form should not be like a decoration which is applied externally to a completed structure. Imagery, for instance, or any other poetic form which is detachable from the substance of the work is in this way rather than being integrated with it, is merely fanciful and not truly imaginative. The distinction made by Coleridge in the Biographia Literaria. This point about organic form applies above all to sincerity. Sincerity comprising truth to experience, honesty towards the self, and the capacity for human empathy and compassion is a self quantity quality which resides within the language of literature. It isn't a fact or an intention behind the work, which could be gleaned by comparing, say, a poet's view of an event with other more factual versions, or from discovering independent external information about an author's history or conduct. Rather, sincerity is to be discovered within the text, in which such matters as the avoidance of cliché or of overinflated forms of expression it shows in the use of first-hand individualistic description, in the understand stated expression of feeling, whereby preferably the emotion is allowed to emerge implicitly from the presentation of an event. Moreover, when the language achieves these qualities, then the truly sincere poet can be transcend the sense of distance between language and material and can make the language seem to enact which what it depicts, thus apparently abolishing the necessary distances between word and things. Again, The next idea follows from the previous one. What is valued in literature is the silent showing and demonstrating of something rather than the explaining or saying of it. Hence, ideas as such are worthless in literature until given the concrete embodiment of enactment. Thus, several of the explicit comments and formulations often cited in literary history contain specific denegations of ideas as such and have a distinct anti-intellectual flavor to them. Hence, we see the elevation of the characteristic English lit idea of tactile enactment of sensuous immediacy of the concrete representation of thought and so on. According to this idea, which is of course itself an idea in spite of the fact that the idea in question is a professed distrust of ideas, words should mime or demonstrate or act out or sound out what they signify rather than just representing it in an abstract way. This idea is stated with a special fervency in the work of F.R. Lewis for a critique of the enactment idea. See the enactment fallacy by the present author in Essay Criticism, July 1980. The job of criticism is to interpret the text to mediate between it and the reader. A theoretical account of the nature of reading or the literature in general isn't useful in criticism and will, simply if attempted, encumber critics with preconceived ideas which will get between them and the text. Perhaps in this phrase preconceived ideas we get another glimpse into the nature of this persuasive distrust of ideas within liberal humanism, for there seems to be the notion that somehow all ideas are preconceived in the sense that they will come between the reader and the text given half a chance. There is, in fact, the clear mark here of what is called English empiricism, which can be defined as a determination to trust only what is made evident to the senses or experienced directly. Ultimately, this attitude goes back at least to the philosophy of John Locke, 1632 to 1704, which gives a philosophical expression to it. His book Essay Concerning Human Understanding, 1690, puts forward the view that the ideas are formed when direct sense impressions from the world are imprinted on the mind. The mind then assembles these so give rise to the process of thinking. Locke rejected introspective speculation as a source of valid knowledge and insisted on the need for direct experience and evidence of things. Traditional English studies, we might say, has always been Lockean in this sense. Literary theorizing from Aristotle to Lewis, some key moments. The average student or teacher of English literature up to the 1970s would probably have made a fairly limited direct contact with this body of work, since the whole thrust of the subject was away from this kind of generalizing position taking. Aristotle offers famous definition of tragedy, insists that literature is about character and that character is revealed through action, and tries to identify the required stages in the progress of the Aristotle called catharsis, whereby these emotions are exercised rather than exorcised, as the audience identifies with the plight of the central character. Sir Philip Sidney, who wrote his Apology for Poetry, in about 1580, Sidney was intent on expanding the implications of the ancient definition of literature first formulated by the Latin poet Ovid 43 BC to AD 17, who has said that its mission is docere delectando, to teach by delighting, meaning approximately by entertaining. Sidney also quotes Horace to the effect that a poem is a speaking picture with the scent to teach and delight. Johnson's lives of the poets and prefaces to Shakespeare can be seen both as another major step forward in critical theory and as a part of the English tradition of practical criticism, since he is the first to offer detailed commentary on the work of a single author prior to Johnson. The only text which had ever been subjected to this intensive scrutiny was the Bible and equivalent sacred books of other religions. The extension of this practice to work other than those thought to be direct product of divine inspiration marks a significant moment of progress in the development of secular humanism. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, and Shelley. One of the main texts in Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads. What Wordsworth wrote in this preface was the product of collaborative discussions between himself and Coleridge. The introduction was added to the second edition of the ballads, published in 1800, after the first of 1798 had been met with puzzlement. The book blends high literature and popular literature since it contains literary ballads constructed on the model of popular oral ballads of ordinary country people. A specific poetic vocabulary has required the avoidance of simple everyday terms for things and an elaborate system of rhyme, and a highly compressed form of grammar had reduced the verbal texture of much greater density than that of ordinary language. It also anticipates issues of great interest to contemporary critical theories such as relationship between poetic language and ordinary language and that between literature and other kinds of writing. A second significant work from the Romantic era was Coleridge's misleading title Biographia Literaria. The title might lead us to expect a work like Johnson's Lives of the Poets, but in fact much of it directly addresses the ideas contained in Wordsworth's preface, showing by a close consideration of aspects of his work that Wordsworth writes his best poetry when he is furthest away from adherence to his own theories of what poetry should be. Coleridge came to disagree completely with the view that the language of poetry must strive to become more like the language of prose. The argument dovetails neatly with the works already cited. If literature and other works differed in their aims and effects, as Aristotle and Sidney had maintained, and if poetry, unlike other kinds of writing, aims to teach by entertaining, then the major way in which the entertaining is done must be through language in which it is written. The language entertains by the fictive qualities. This is the source of aesthetic effect. In Shelley's A Defense for Poetry 1821, which sees poetry as essentially engaged in what a group of 20th century Russian critics like later called defamiliarization, Shelley anticipates this term since for him poetry strips the veil of familiarity from the world. It purges from our inward side the film of familiarity. It compels us to feel that which we perceive and imagine that which we know. This remarkable critical document also anticipates T.S. Eliot's notion of impersonality put forward in his 1919 essay Tradition and Individual Talent, whereby there is a distinction between, as we might call it, the author who is the person behind the work and the writer who is, so speak, the person in the work. In Eliot's view, the greater separation between the two, the better, since the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and mind which creates, so that the poetry is not simply the conscious rendering of personal experience into words. Indeed, the idea of unconscious is an essential one in romanticism and implicit in everything written about poetry by another major romanticist. John Keats. Keats did not write formal literary theory in the way Wordsworth, Coleridge, and Shelley did, but he did reflect on poetry in a sustained way in his letters. Keats' idea of negative capability also amounts to the same privileging of the unconscious, the same desire to allow its scope to work negative. Unconscious, this same desire to allow the scope to work negative capability, but being when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, Doubts without any irritable reaching after fact and reason later to his brother 21st December 1817 in the critical writings of the Romantics. Then there are many anticipations of the concerns of critical theory. He saw literature as a possible replacement for religion and the Stuttgart believed that the middle class on whom the burden and responsibility of democracy largely fell had been progressively debased by materialism and Philistinism. Arnold's The Function of Criticism at the Present Time and the Study of Poetry stresses the importance for literature of remaining disinterested, by which he means the politically detached and uncommitted to any specific program of action. The object as in itself is release, without wanting to press the inside gain into surface of a specific line of action. Arnold's key literary critical devices the notion of touchstone, which avoids any definition of desirable literary qualities and merely suggests using suspects of the past as means of measuring and assessing the literature of today. A touchstone is so called because Gould oft tried it by it. Matthew Arnold used the word in his essay The Study of Poetry 1880 in connection with literary criterion standard. He suggests that his touchstone method should provide the basis for a real rather than a historic or personal estimate of poetry. F.I. Lewis, T.S. Stillion, William Empson, and I. Richards. The major critical ideas are the notion of the dissociation of sensibility developed in the course of his review article of Herbert Greene edition of the Metaphysical Poets, the notion of poetic impersonality developed in the course of his two-part essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, and the notion of objective correlative developed in his essay on Hamlet. A dissociation of sensibility occurred in the 17th century, radically separating thought from feeling in one is one from which historical evidence have never been found. The best use of the idea simply as a way of describing the special qualities of mind and sensibility which we detect in the metaphysical poets as a historical generalization, it seems quite works without support. The idea of impersonality was partly Eliot's way of deflecting current thinking about poetry away from ideas of originality and self-expression which derive from Romanticism. Eliot's own personality and the education he had received at Harvard made this emphasis on the individual highly. The objective correlative finally is really another encapsulation of English empiricist attitudes. It holds that the very best of expressing an emotion in art is to find some vehicle for it in gesture, action, or concrete symbolism rather than approaching it directly or descriptively. The former is us showing something in the character's own words or an action which we actually see on the stage if it is a play, while the latter is telling the audience or reader about things they don't see for themselves or experience in the direct speech of the characters. All Eliot's major critical ideas are thus flawed and unsatisfactory, and perhaps they were long standing currencies indicative of the theoretical vacuum into which they were launched. Arnold, for example, takes the pantheon of past great writers more or less for granted. He does not question the excellence of Dante, for instance, which is why Dante can become a touchstone. By contrast, Lewis sometimes wrote essays attacking the reputation of major established figures, and indeed, it was the essence of his method to argue that some reputation would not stand up to some kind of close textual scrutiny he constantly recommended. F.I. Lewis began as an admirer of Eliot's critical work as well as of his poetry, but later greatly modified in his views. He avoided the coining of critical vocabulary and instead used the critical terms, words, or phrases which already had established lay senses. Life, for instance, is used by Lewis almost as a critical term as it is not of felt experience. Lewis' extreme popularity was partly due to the fact that he was essentially a kind of combined rebirth of Johnson and Arnold, offering Again, the former's moralism and latter social vision and anti-theoretical critical practice. Amson's book, The Seven Types of Ambiguity, was itself somewhat ambiguous in its effect. The word ambiguity in the book's title can be translated as verbal difficulty, and Empson unravels his example by meticulous textual surgery rather than references out to a wider text. As we go from ambiguity type 1 to type 7, we seem to be approaching the frontiers of language where the territory eventually becomes unmappable and we seem to end up looking to a void of linguistic intermittency. Liberal humanism in practice, a liberal humanist approach to this tale, or to be more specific, a Leicester approach, might focus on the evident conflict of values in the story between art and life. The central point of commentary and interpretation might be the moralist argument that true value lies in the lived life of the unique individual and that is disastrous for the artist to fail to recognize the necessary subservience of art to a communal reality. Two things stand out in this approach. First, this kind of reading is driven ultimately by its moral convictions, laudable in themselves, of course, rather than by any model of what constitutes a systematic approach to literary criticism. The robust championing of life in the above sketch makes the term libicide seem an appropriate one to apply to it. The second notable aspect of it is that it seems to pass matters of form, structure, genre, and so on, and launches straight into the discussion of matters of content. Of theory. The questions these two approaches centered upon concerned matters of language and philosophy rather than history or context. The approach known as post-colonialism rejects the idea of a universally applicable Marxist explanation of things and emphasizes the separateness or otherness of the uniquely fragmented nature um, of much contemporary experience. Feminism too shows signs of dissolving into a loose federation known as gender studies, with gay and lesbian texts emerging as distinct fields of literature and hence implying and generating appropriate and distinct critical approaches. Also, part of this 1990s federation was black feminist or womanist criticism. Womanism now designates more generally social and critical theory with specific references to women of marginalized groups. Key takeaways of this theory are: politics is pervasive, second, language is constitutive, third, truth is provisional, fourth, meaning is contingent, fifth, human nature is a myth. होप आज की वीडियो आपको पसंद है, कैसी लगी हमें कमेंट करके बताओ। अगर कोई सजेशंस एंड डाउट्स है तो वो भी आप कमेंट सेक्शन में ड्रॉप कर सकते हैं। अगर वीडियो अच्छी लगी तो लाइक शेयर एंड सब्सक्राइब टू माई चैनल। मिलते हैं कल एक और informative video के साथ शाम 4 बजे। Till then, keep watching and keep supporting the Soulful Diary. Thank you.